President Biden has now landed for his 3-day trip to Israel and Saudi Arabia. This is the first time the American president has been in either country in over 5 years, and the first time a president has been anywhere in the region before. President Biden arrives against a complicated and shifting backdrop. There are several important developments across the landscape. Just to name a few, we have a ceasefire in Yemen, improving Arab-Israeli relations, the collapse of the Israeli government in June, faltering Iran nuclear talks, and skyrocketing oil prices brought on in part by the war in Ukraine. But amidst all of this, it's president's likely meeting, in some form or other at least, with Saudi Arabia's Prince Mohammed bin Salman that's drawn the most attention. Biden once promised to turn Saudi Arabia into a pariah on account of its dismal human rights record, and especially the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Biden cut off the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia in the early weeks of his administration, reversing long-standing U.S. practice. Now, however, in a Washington Post editorial over the weekend, the president argued that Saudi Arabia was in fact crucial to his broader strategy of competing with China and dealing with Russia. What should we make of Biden's decision to go to Israel and especially Saudi Arabia? What would make this trip worthwhile? How can we evaluate it strategically and in terms of U.S. domestic politics? With me to help us think all this through are two of Carnegie's top experts on these questions, Aaron David Miller and Yasmine Farouk. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Chris.
I want to start with the basic question here. Why is he going? When the Biden administration came into office, it seemed as though their strategy was going to be to right-size the U.S. role in the Middle East. We had the reduced terrorist threat, energy independence in the United States, and the deplorable human rights records of the region's autocrats. All of these things together seem to augur for a downgrading of the region's overall priority in U.S. national security strategy. But here we are, 18 months into Biden's term, and he's headed there, and at no small cost domestically. What should we make of this? What's driving it? The big question for me is whether or not this is a shift in strategy, in overall approach to the region, or whether it's just about domestic politics and, above all, super high gas prices that we have back here in the U.S. Aaron, let me start with you. What are your thoughts on this? Aaron, you're muted.
Clearly one of the finest analysts of Saudi Arabia today. Look, I think the trip is less a reflection of a major strategic reset toward what the Biden administration has acknowledged as a very troubled region, and more a response to domestic politics and the exigencies created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, the idea of the trip originated and actually committed in a phone call between former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and the president in April. And I think Mr. Biden, whose support for Israel is very, very, very deep in his emotional and political DNA, wasn't going to repeat the mistakes of his boss, Barack Obama, by not visiting Israel early in the first year of his term. I think the president probably decided after that, relatively late in the game, because I think he's very conflicted still about the visit to Saudi Arabia, to plan a visit to the kingdom. I'd only conclude by saying that the Russian invasion created two new political and economic realities to which the administration is now responding. One is the reality of a dysfunctional relationship between supply and demand in an already tightened oil market. Russia produces 1 out of every 10 barrels of oil in global supply. You take that off the market in an already tightened supply situation, and it's problematic. And second is, I think, the view that the administration holds that they are now involved in a long-term struggle against clearly Russia, but also rising China and a relationship between the two. And I think there was a sense that in this struggle, which will last probably beyond the Biden administration. There was a need to shore up, secure, make functional some of the dysfunctional relationships that they pursued, particularly with the Gulf states. One last point, the Israeli piece of this will be the easy lift. It'll be much more complicated, I suspect, when the president gets to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to talk some more about that part of the trip. But Yasmine, let me go over to you. You have a great piece in the New York Times this morning that seems to take a somewhat different view from what Aaron just laid out. I mean, you see an opportunity here amidst all of this sort of turmoil and chaos and criticism, which says to me that perhaps you think that it is about more than just U.S. domestic politics, that it's also about building on some kind of a bigger strategic relationship. Is that accurate?
I think, yeah, it captures part of what I was saying. That the timing of the visit is definitely has to do with domestic politics inside the United States and the price of oil. But the need for a personal interaction between the leadership of the United States and Saudi Arabia was something that administration officials realized even before Russia invaded Ukraine. The United States doesn't want to be entangled in the politics and the conflicts and the instability of the Middle East. And one of the cornerstones to realize this was pronounced by Brett McGurk back in November when he was at the Manama Dialogue. And he described the US strategy in the Middle East as being back to the basics. And he stressed the point of reinvesting in the partnerships that the United States have with the Gulf countries and all the countries in the Middle East, and a very realist vision of, dealing with the Middle East as is, not trying to transform it, but trying to realize to the utmost possible U.S. strategic interests and objectives in the region as it is. My problem with this strategy right now is that, first of all, anything the United States does or doesn't in the Middle East has an impact. So right now, the administration is working, for example, on containing Iran, and part of the strategy is the normalization with Israel, or integrating Israel, especially militarily, in some kind of defense structure, or at least defense coordination with the Gulf countries. And these policies have a potential to change the region, to have concrete consequences on the region. And they are not really compatible with this announced strategy of we don't want to transform the Middle East, and yet constantly saying that we are transforming the Middle East because we are recreating, the defense structure and architecture in the region. And about my point in the article this morning about the opportunity, it really has to do with the human rights side of it, and this tension that exists between values and interests in the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the Biden administration. I believe that politics is the art of possible, but I also believe that there should be at least an attempt not to give up on the values for the sake of the U.S. interests, even if we're living a critical moment.
Okay, let's talk about what might happen over the course of the next couple of days, and maybe break it down into the question of deliverables on U.S. Domestic politics, and then the larger strategic and potentially human rights deliverables that both of you just mentioned, especially you, Yasmine. Starting with the domestic side, just so that we're clear, obviously one reason that he's going to the region is to try to get the Saudis to increase oil production. But a lot of analysts are saying that there's not much that the kingdom can actually do anyway, at least to increase its output in the near term. So just to nail this down, what should we be expecting in terms of outcomes that would constitute some degree of success for the president on the oil front? Aaron, let me start with you.
I've been looking at the question of the relationship between domestic politics and the president's trip, and frankly, I see almost no immediate gain politically for Joe Biden from any aspect of this trip. Sure, the midterms are coming, and yes, Biden is extremely pro-Israel. It's, as I mentioned, deep in his political and emotional DNA. It's not going to matter, frankly, with respect to what's on the minds of most Americans. So I don't see any immediate gain. I do believe that over time, and I suspect the administration does not want to push oil as in the public frame of this visit, because Mr. Biden does not want to be perceived to have traded his commitments to human rights, particularly in view of the emptying of that frame during the 4 years of his predecessor, as if he struck some sort of bargain. The Saudis will increase production and they're going to overlook, or the president's going to participate in the rehabilitation of Mohammed bin Salman. They want to avoid that. So realistically, they're downplaying the oil piece of this. And I think with good reason, because there are many reasons why the Saudis are unwilling and unable to ramp up production to the extent that it would have any real impact on the challenge that Mr. Biden faces, which is gas is actually present gas is coming down now 2 or 3 weeks in a row, largely as a consequence of economic lockdowns in China. So I see no gain for him on the political side with respect to the one issue, the inflationary cycle and gas prices that most Americans care about. The rest of this stuff, the foreign policy stuff, I think is important to folks inside the Beltway. And as George Will wrote a couple months ago, when it comes to foreign policy, Americans want, quote, as little of it as possible. And in this particular phase, with the focus on domestic politics, I just don't see much of a political benefit, Chris, for the president.
Yasmine, just sticking for a second with oil, do you agree that it doesn't make much sense for President Biden to press the Saudis, or at least to use this trip in some way to get them to increase output, because perhaps they're going to do it anyway, and there's not that much of an impact that it would have on U.S. gas prices in the end anyway?
Look, I'm not a specialist in the oil markets, but I try to read and learn as much as I can. So there is a lot of skepticism on whether a Saudi gesture would actually, change the oil prices at the pump, as Americans like to say it. And as Aaron said, but I think what the administration is after here is really the symbolic gesture, because also oil markets are very sensitive to geopolitics and, to political developments. The Saudis themselves have an interest in not letting Russia take, their market shares in Asia, which is something that we saw happening the last months. But at the same time, the visit itself is supposed to generate just a goodwill, just a primary contact that allows the United States and Saudi Arabia to work on this oil issue, because the oil issue is not just about oil. Definitely, Saudi Arabia has been making a lot of money thanks to oil prices, money that the Saudi Arabia needs, because Vision 2030, which is really the main project of Mohammed bin Salman, hasn't been generating the income or getting the foreign direct investment that it needs, right? And so he has been benefiting from this money. In addition to the fact that, sticking to OPEC Plus is also a geopolitical issue for Saudi Arabia. Russia, aside from tensions that took place once in the history of this deal, Russia had stuck to its end of the bargain, right? And the Saudis think or see that in order to build a hedging strategy, or to continue their policy of diversifying their international relations, they have to show to other partners that they can be trusted as well. So oil is not just for them about the price and the money. It's about the price, the money, but also the geopolitics of it. And I think this is why I would expect some kind of announcement on oil, but some kind of announcement that, predicts better coordination, further coordination for the stability of oil markets. But a drastic change is not something that I would expect, at least in the immediate term.
Okay, so if the domestic political argument for Biden taking this trip is actually maybe not as strong as it appeared to be at the outset or on the surface, let's look at the strategic potential outcomes that we could see over the course of the next couple of days. Are there any concrete things, Aaron, that you think could come out, including surprises that might make the trip worthwhile?
Again, it's not just Saudi. The Israel stop which is the one Mr. Biden, I think, is looking forward to the most, given his deeply entrenched pro-Israeli views. There'll be a Jerusalem declaration, which will reaffirm, as many other declarations have, the strategic partnership between the United States and Israel. It'll be another opportunity for Mr. Biden and Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken to talk to the Israelis at the highest levels on the implications of an agreement with Iran or no agreement with Iran. I'm sure that the public face of this trip for Mr. Biden will be to keep whatever differences, and there are differences that separate the United States and Israel, not just on the question of Iran, but on Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. He will keep them out of view, and I don't see any. Mr. Biden is going to, visit. He'll see a demonstration of Iron Dome. They'll discuss Iron Beam, which is the laser technology that the Israelis are trying to deploy. There'll be reaffirmation of Israel's relations with the Abraham Accords. I just don't see anything new that's going to come out in Israel that would change the strategic picture or the trend lines that we all know well in terms of the strategic picture.
Yasmine, what about you? Are there any deliverables that you would lead you over the course of the next couple of days to conclude that this trip was a real success?
Again, the trip in itself was an objective, at least when it comes to Saudi Arabia. This personal contact was an objective in itself because it is supposed to initiate better coordination, less tense talks about other issues, including oil, by the way. Yeah. And so I think that, first of all, if this goes fine, if what the administration is looking for, meaning easing the personal tensions between President Biden and the Crown Prince, actually happen, then we might see later some kind of progress on the issues that the U.S. wants from Saudi Arabia. I think one of the issues on which we will see some kind of progress, not because the Biden administration was able to realize a breakthrough, but because it's an issue that has been in the works for a long time, is that issue of some kind of integrated air and missile defense in the Gulf. There is now the challenges to this have always come from Gulf countries, by the way. There's an issue of trust between them. But I think that the urgency of the Iran situation today has pushed them to reconsider those challenges. The fact that now many of them see in Israel a potential ally, a potential plan B that is not without risk, by the way. And I think we might talk about this later for them. And they realize that it is not without risk for them, is something that might enable the Biden administration to make some progress on this, because again, it coincides with a policy in the Biden administration to be less involved in the defense of those countries and make sure that while it is less involved, they still remain in the US orbit. So I think this is something where we might see some progress. I know that the Biden administration and those countries are already working on this, on that air defense. And again, it's something that previous administrations for years have been trying to do. Also, we will see some progress, concrete progress on the issue of the islands, I think, between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Of course, it will be overinflated as, normalization and New Dawn and whatever you want. But this is something that the Saudis want to happen. This is something that, as far as I understand, the Israelis are willing to give, again, because it's a sign of goodwill. It establishes more public contacts between Israel and Saudi Arabia. So this is something that we'll see developments on, or something concrete about, including the overflights of Israel in Saudi airspace. And I think that the regional summit that President Biden would like to have is also meant to show some kind of united front against Iran, even though differences will continue. But at least diplomatically, it's going to look like that. Those countries have a minimum of common threat perception, and that the United States still have them in the orbit.
Let me just add, Chris, the idea of integration, which I think, it is an important theme, and I don't want to be remiss if I dismissed it or de-emphasized it. the notion of integration has been first among the GCCs, but is an idea that originated actually in the Obama administration, I believe, at a summit between Barack Obama and the GCC, heads of the GCC back in 2015. It was not sold and made effective then, but I think now the new wrinkle is under CENTCOM, and Israel is now in the CENTCOM region. Under CENTCOM, much work has been done to integrate through shared warning systems, sensors, which already are in place. I mean, the Saudis and other key Gulf states already have American weapons system. The Saudis have THAAD, Patriots, and much work has been done to create a sort of war room, which CENTCOM is managing, which would create a shared basis of intelligence to warn against incoming drones and cruise missiles. Ballistic missile technology is one thing, but the real threat has proven to be drones and cruise missiles. So I think that's important, and much will be made of it. I think it's important to point out that this is not going to be there's no Arab-Israeli NATO in the works here. No Article 5 commitment with respect to mutual defense. It will be interesting, though, and we may not know to what degree the conversations between the president and the crown prince, because I think that's where the work on this visit will be done. I mean, I think the president is going to have to deal at some length personally over the same table, not with the king, who probably will be present for the first large meeting, but most of the work is going to be done between MBS and the president and his advisors. One of the subjects that's going to come up is the issue of security guarantees, which has been at the heart and at the root of Saudi disillusionment with the United States, and not just with this administration, with the preceding two administrations, both with Trump. It was on Trump's watch, after all, that somebody's drones, let's call them for the sake of argument, Iranian/Houthi drones or cruise missiles, took 5% of the global production of oil off the market for 2 weeks as a consequence of in September of 2019. And the American response, according to the Saudis, was, to say the least, inadequate. The Emiratis faced the same experience with strikes, and they wanted a more robust American commitment. So that will be very important. The degree to which we are prepared, the administration is prepared to give binding security guarantees that would involve congressional consultation and sell offensive weaponry to Saudi Arabia. My understanding is that for the moment, defensive weaponry, yes, air-to-air missile systems, but no PGMs or offensive weaponry are on the table. But that whole complex of issues has been at the root, at least from the Saudi perception, of their unhappiness with the administration. So that's going to be I think, a key subject of discussion.
I think it's a really important point, perhaps that hasn't been discussed enough. There are a lot of voices here in Washington that are calling for the United States to significantly deepen its relationship on the security front with Saudi Arabia and with other Gulf states, especially if you take this in the context of, for example, the remarks from the U.S. National Security Advisor yesterday or the day before about Iran's provision of UAVs to Russia. It does seem like there are these deepening fault lines emerging. They've always been there, of course, but they seem to be deepening even more. To what extent should the United States be throwing its weight even more behind Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states? Yasmine, let me start with you.
I think it depends on how much the United States wants them to be supportive of its policies, especially towards Iran. I mean, those countries will be and are the primary target of Iran. Iran, doesn't attack Israel. Iran has, I don't think that Iran has responded to every single time Israelis targeted it in Syria. Those countries are scared that if they go on with the U.S. plans of putting pressure on Iran, which are in their interest, yes, but they are very cautious, and they need support and they need guarantees that if they continue supporting the US policies, that the US is going to be there for them when they are attacked. But here's the thing, the change in the policy of those countries is that there is now more willingness to exert some effort, and I'm not saying all the effort needed, some effort in building their own capacities, their own defense capacities. And I think that this is what the United States should invest in. But then you immediately have the problem of human rights and the potential of, selling arms or defense systems or surveillance systems or whatever you want that are going to be used by those countries in human rights violations. So I think this is a dilemma that the United States has to deal with and has to try to figure out with those countries. But the focus should not be on putting, on going to the extreme of putting American soldiers, in harm's way to defend those countries, but how to build the capacities of those countries institutionally, but also in terms of skills and defense and weapons in order for them to be able to defend themselves against Iranian targets. And I think that there is an ongoing effort between DOD and those countries to realize this. But as I said, I previously heard American officials saying, yes, but our problem is that when we build the capacities of those countries and when we give them the needed systems, we don't always get to tell them how to use those systems and how to behave using those systems in the region. But I think it's time that the United States and those countries have some kind of framework to regulate this kind of cooperation. But it will need a sustained U.S. commitment, at least on the short and medium term.
So you would support the U.S. effort, Pentagon effort, to help strengthen their integrated air and missile defense systems, but you wouldn't recommend going so far as to discuss security guarantees to those states?
No, because again, what does security guarantees mean? Does it mean a treaty? I remember when the Trump administration was discussing the Middle East Strategic Alliance, I think the United Arab Emirates asked for some kind of Article 5. I don't think this is going to happen. It's not going to pass in the US. And I think that, those countries should learn to manage their expectations and ask for things that could actually happen. And I think what could actually happen is working on building their capacities. And again, I insist not only giving them the arms, but the skills and also institution building when it comes to defense. And part of what I wrote, for example, this morning in my article is that there should be also a long-term strategy. There should be a short-term strategy for the here and now and the 4 years of President Biden, but also a long-term capacity. This is the third president that is elected on an agenda of focusing the U.S. Efforts, money, and time and resources on the domestic situation inside the United States, on disengaging from Middle East politics and conflicts, and yet there is no long-term strategy. There is no long-term vision of how this is going to do. I mean, they all agree on the objective, but every president wants deliverables now. There is a need for a longer-term strategy, and I think this is what DoD is trying to do and has been trying to do. And yes, I support it when it comes to air defense, because those countries do need it. Saudi Arabia does need this kind of defense.
So as the United States, if it is reaffirming its relationship with these countries, potentially even suggesting that it might deepen it to some degree over time, what should it be saying to them, and especially to Israel, about its willingness to support their own pushback against Iran? Israel is obviously engaged in an increasingly extensive campaign against Iran's nuclear program, which itself continues to progress. We have no progress on a return to the nuclear deal. So what should the president's message be when he's talking with not just the Gulf states, but also with Israel about America's willingness to support these kinds of actions? Aaron, what do you think?
It's a fascinating question, because I think we're now at the point where even the most enthusiastic supporters of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action may have reached the conclusion that it's simply not going to happen. Although there are all kinds of rumors and reports. The Israeli press reported that Mossad now believes that an agreement is possible and that negotiations will resume after the Biden trip. Who knows? The problem with Iran is fundamentally clear. Even the JCPOA was only a transactional accord. It was designed to manage a problem for which the United States and Israel and the Europeans had no solution, which is what to do about Iran's putative, its capacity to produce fissile material, and then if it made a political decision to weaponize, to actually create a deliverable nuclear device. That problem is going to hover over this region as long as you have an Iranian regime driven by a profound sense of insecurity on one hand and entitlement on the other. That's not going to go away. And without some restraint or constraint that gives the Iranians an incentive not to push the envelope, we're now going to enter a very fraught period. The hope, of course, is that Iran is smart enough not to enrich to 90%, which is weapons grade, because from there, it's weaponization. That Iran will maintain below the threshold, that the Israeli campaign between the wars, what they now deem as Operation Octopus, where they strike the head, not just the tentacles, in their sabotage, assassination, cyber campaign. The Israelis won't do something that provokes, or Iran won't do something, killing a bunch of Americans in Iraq or Syria, very possible, which forces the United States into to retaliate. You've got an issue of what would keep this balance in play. Some argue that it's deterrence. Some argue that the United States should make it unmistakably clear. These are the red lines. If they're crossed, you risk American military retaliation. And I think the Iranians want to avoid that. An Israeli strike may already be baked into the Iranian cake because it has limits and constraints. Some argue that we should provide the Israelis with things they want. The KC-46 tanker, which would enable long-range refueling, and this massive ordnance penetrator, this enormous device, the bunker buster, that we should actually provide the Israelis with these weapon systems. It's an unmistakable signal about what would happen. I am wary about all of this because I think if you look at the behavior of the last three administrations, it shows a fundamental, even the Trump administration and its maximum pressure campaign against Iran. Obama, Trump, and Biden were all risk averse when it came to tripping into the prospects of an American-Iranian confrontation, which could occur if Israel and Iran end up in a serious regional confrontation. And this is where security guarantees to the Gulf becomes relevant. I don't see Iran attacking. It's not Saddam Hussein. Iran is not going to attack Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. Asymmetrical warfare, cruise and drones, yes. But should Israel and Iran get into this, the prospects of given our bases in Qatar and the Emirates, the prospects grow for an Iranian strike against our Gulf partners. And that does raise the question of American involvement, not a proxy war, not what we're doing in Ukraine. We actually have bases in the zone of conflict. We have 70,000 Americans in Saudi Arabia. All of a sudden, the equities become very important, and it becomes a domestic political issue. So war avoidance, seems to me, is unmistakable. The last line of the president's op-ed had a reference to, I think it was, I plan to keep it that way. And the way he wanted it kept was no Americans deployed after Iraq and Afghanistan in combat situations. Now we are deployed in Iraq and in Syria, and it gets dicey in Syria, or it could. So I see risk aversion prevailing, Chris and Yasmine, not risk readiness.
One of the main arguments for what appeared to be, say, a year and a half or 2 years ago, a growing, I wouldn't call it a consensus, but at least a movement to reduce the level of priority that the United States places on the Middle East is exactly the dynamics that you're pointing out, and the concern that the United States could get dragged inadvertently into an Iran, Saudi Arabia conflict. I want to go to some questions from our listeners here, but Yasmine, I want to give you the opportunity to comment on the question that I had posed a minute ago about what do you think President Biden's message to Israeli, Saudi, and other leaders that he meets with ought to be when it comes to Iran? If anyone has questions, please start putting them into the comments box.
Look, I agree with everything that Aaron said, except for the fact that I don't know. I didn't see Trump as being that risk averse. I mean, he assassinated Soleimani. There were incidents in the Gulf waters between Iranian boats and, Americans. And it wasn't risk averse. But it delivered. I mean, the maximum pressure campaign was a total failure. It got the United States and the world and the region in a worse situation. But the Iranians got the message that the United States has teeth and that the United States is willing to use them. Right? There were increasing attacks. There was escalation. The problem is that the Trump administration didn't really have a diplomatic plan next to, the escalation. But it wasn't risk averse. I mean, the region was living in a risk. The main problem of Gulf countries, I believe, is that they don't have their own plan. They ask the United States to have a plan for the United States, but also for them. So when it comes to the message that the Biden administration needs to have for them, again, is how far the United States is going to go in terms of defending them. I'm like Aaron, I don't see Iran invading Saudi Arabia. I see it continuing the same kind of attacks that it does through the Houthis or through the militias from Iraq. And I also see the problem is another side of this escalation, which is if Iran gets the bomb, I don't think Saudi Arabia would encourage a military strike against Iran, but I think Saudi Arabia would want to go nuclear. And it won't only be Saudi Arabia. I think that the only country in that region that would be ready for a military conflict with Iran over its nuclear file is Israel. The rest of them think that, okay, if Iran is going to go nuclear, we would go nuclear. So I think that I totally agree with Aaron. The party that would get the United States involved in a military conflict with Iran is Israel, rather than Gulf countries, who right now are looking to move from defense to deterrence and eventually go nuclear if Iran goes nuclear.
Let me go back to the original place that we started, which is that the big controversy here is obviously President Biden's potential meeting or face-to-face or sitting in the same room as MBS. In the broader frame, is there anything that Biden should or could do that we should expect on the human rights front in Saudi Arabia? Yasmine, let me start with you, because you seem to be saying, if I understand you correctly, that this kind of reset in the relationship with Saudi Arabia is actually important to getting them to make improvements on the human rights front. Is that correct? Or if not, what is your thinking?
Listen, if there is one country in the world that can have Saudi Arabia make any kind of improvement of human rights, it's the United States. The national security of Saudi Arabia, the security of the Saudi regime is highly dependent on the United States. So if the United States decides that it is too risky or it is too much time consuming to talk to the Saudis about values and human rights, nobody else will do it. And I think that, as I wrote in my piece, the Saudis have a stake in a better relationship not just with the White House, but also with Congress, the American media, and the American public opinion. And when it comes to the business, when it comes to technology, there is a preference for the United States, even if the main trading partner is China. But Saudis have always wanted what's best, most expensive, most shiny out there. And it happens to be American. So the United States has leverage that it should use. I am not sure President Biden is going to talk about human rights. I certainly hope so. The Saudis don't want to hear anything about human rights. But I certainly hope that he will, because again, he is the only person who could make a difference. And if he doesn't, nobody else will.
Aaron, do you think he can do this? Do you think he will?
Look, I think this is extremely complicated. I think the president is very conflicted about this visit. I think he understands perfectly. One picture is worth 1,000, more than 1,000 words in this case. One picture is worth more than 1,000 words. He is participating, I think, grudgingly in what I call the rehabilitation of Mohammed bin Salman, which is already underway in the region and in the international community. MBS will chair the meeting. He as president of the head of the GCC, rotating head of the GCC. I think the president is conflicted. I think there's a strong constituency in the administration. I think he came to this decision hard, and I think it was relatively late. I think there's a constituency in the administration that believes that unlike Lehman Brothers, the U.S.-Saudi relationship is too big to fail. America has interests, it has adversaries, it has allies, and it has to make a dysfunctional relationship function. I mean, I have a blind spot on this issue. I admit it. Jamal was a friend of mine, as he was a friend of so many in Washington. And it's not just Jamal. Freedom House reports that the Saudis are engaged in transnational repression. Yasmine referred to this in her op-ed. At least 14 countries, the Saudis are involved in intimidating physically or digitally their dissidents and their opponents. MBS is an extraordinary reformer. He's brought changes to Saudi Arabia, frankly, having watched this for 40 years, that I think are extraordinary. But he is a repressive, ruthless authoritarian. And it seems to me, we'll see what happens when King Salman passes from the scene. And he becomes the absolute, what is made formal, what is now informal, that he is the absolute ruler of Saudi Arabia. If I were Biden, I would create, for his own personal credibility, I would create some sort of public values frame in Saudi Arabia, not privately, sure. We've raised human rights issues with the Sisi, with the Israelis, privately all the time. It's a risk creating a public frame to talk openly about American expectations and our commitment to values. But 4 years after Jamal's murder and dismemberment, there is no accounting, no accountability, and it goes beyond Jamal. Basically, as David Ignatius and Fred Ryan wrote in the Post, MBS got away with murder. I'm not blaming the president. I like Joe Biden and respect him. But this visit is going to contribute to this rehabilitation. And I think there ought to be some effort on the party administration to lay down a marker publicly. I doubt, knowing what I know about the Department of State and the U.S. government on this issue, I would hope, but I very much doubt it's going to happen.
Yasmine, my sense is that you have a more optimistic view of the possibility that MBS may evolve and that we might, over the long term, see a return to some of the more reformist policies that he had pursued over the course of the last few years. Is that correct? And if so, would your recommendation be that the president not say anything about human rights, or do you think that he ought to say something?
Honestly, I'm not sure that MBS is going to evolve when it comes to freedom of expression and political repression. But I do believe that the United States has the leverage to get what MBS would consider concessions or compromises that, in the United States are actually rights. And this is because, as I said, for example, I cite in my article, I talk about, prioritizing digital diplomacy, digital repression, and, regulating the internet and the use of surveillance tools and everything else is a priority to the Biden administration. I mean, there was at least two documents that were published by the White House, one of them in the framework of the Summit for Democracy on the uses of internet, including the transfer of technologies that allow authoritarian regimes to persecute dissidents, right? And as I mentioned in my article, the US has even gone as far as sanctioning the NSO for selling such tools to Saudi Arabia and other authoritarian countries in the world. I don't think that I don't think that MBS will do this willingly. But I do believe that the United States has the tools, has basically the sticks and the carrots to get some kind of evolution on the human rights situation in the kingdom. I cite the example of digital human rights, but also you have, the Saudis who hold the US passport. And I think this is something because, again, there is always the thinking in the United States around election deadlines, like what can he deliver on this? And I think that this is something that is important to the Americans. Having an American passport should provide some kind of protection, some kind of rights that other governments should indeed recognize. And that goes for Saudi Arabia, but also goes for Israel. And this is why in the article I link, I talk about the case of Shireen Abu Akleh in the framework of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I don't think the evolution is going to be done willingly. Maybe with some maturity. Previous kings, because they were much older than MBS, they have never been democratic, but there was a lot of use of co-optation. There was a realization that the legitimacy of the Al Saud isn't just built on repression. It is also built on a mixture of sticks, carrots. Now, a lot of people talk about the end of the rentier state, that he no longer has the same amounts of money and financial tools to gain the kind of legitimacy that the Saudis or the kings before him had. But it was not just about the money. It was money, but it was also other things about building legitimacy from the bottom up. There was not that amount of repression. In Saudi Arabia, there's a climate of fear, and they always cite this example. People get arrested or called into the security or questioned by the security for criticizing entertainment events, for example. Saudi Arabia wasn't like this before. There isn't a need for this right now. So again, my point being, even if he doesn't evolve and become more mature like previous kings who realized that there isn't that need for so much repression, the United States have the tools to have stakes in the success of Vision 2030 that is so dear to MBS and so crucial to him, that I think would make him willing to make some kind of compromise if in exchange he gets the kind of economic, financial, digital, technological cooperation that allows him to succeed.
We have a couple of questions that have been posed by our listeners. I'm going to sort of combine them and put two of them to both of you. One is, do we have any sense of what the state of Saudi-Iran relations looks like as we look ahead? Is there any hope for a strengthening of relations on the diplomatic front at this point? And second of all, a number of people have raised the broader question of Russia and China's role in the region, which is obviously something that is driving, to some degree, this trip. The concern in particular that in an era of great power competition, it may be important for the United States to compete with China, especially, but also Russia and the Middle East. I'm not sure myself that I buy that, but it is something that does appear to be behind the argument that the president needed to go to the region. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on those two issues. Aaron, let me start with you.
I would say if there is a quote unquote strategic dimension to this trip, and by strategic, I mean a conception that policymakers believe will have to be pursued over time, number one, It's not just a one-fer, months, if not years. And second, that it is basic, strategic, that is basic to the security and prosperity of the United States. There is the notion, and I referred to it earlier, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine and Russia's alliance with China and America's concern and fear of a rising China has created this view that every region of the world needs to somehow be made more pliable to American interests and influence, or at least the United States needs to pursue and deepen their relationships with key states that will be basic to this new, what do you want to call it? Let's call it, for want of a better word, Cold War 2.0. And I think what the administration feared is that the rest of the world, including Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Egypt, Israel, has maintained a good deal of hedging when it comes to committing themselves to the administration's approach of comprehensive sanction and political isolation of Vladimir Putin. And I think part of the concern is that the United States needs to be more active in cultivating relationships with the Saudis and the Emiratis in an effort to sort of brunt increasing Chinese and Russian influence. I do not believe that either Russia or China can replace the United States, certainly as a security or military partner for these regimes. I mean, one look at Russian performance on the battlefield over the last 5 months should give anyone who's counting on Russian military technology and prowess to be in their corner, make them take a very hard look at that. But yeah, I think there is a concern, and I think, frankly, the Saudis and the Emiratis are playing up this hedging strategy in order to send an unmistakable signal to the United States. Don't take us for granted. We're not in your corner, and if you think you can come here and basically tell us what to do, or threaten us, or use your leverage, we're not buying. MBS is not going to break the OPEC Plus agreement with the Russians or alienate Putin. And the Emiratis and the Russians, I think, want to keep friendly relations with China. So I think maybe there's more of a balance to be struck. There was a little known, very quietly announced agreement between the US and Saudi Arabia on 5G. I think it was announced last week. Clear effort to make sure that Huawei doesn't create 5G networks for Saudi Arabia. I missed that. I think it was reported today in the New York Times. It was very quiet, but it's evidence of the fact that that's on the administration's mind.
Yasmine?
I'll address the question on Saudi and Iran. I think the talks are still talking, but there is, the Iranians have always been tough negotiators. They are with the United States and they are with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's priority right now is Yemen, and there is no Iranian willingness to help the Saudis on Yemen, at least for now. Now, the link between the evolution of the talks between, or the progress on the talks between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the talks between the US and Iran on the JCPOA is not very clear. There is now the pending question of what will happen to those regional negotiations that are going on between Iran and different Gulf countries if the JCPOA negotiations fail or they succeed. For the time being, the two countries are still talking. Iran is very much interested in, the looks of it, in saying that in reestablishing diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. It succeeded in having visas for its diplomats to be at the OIC headquarters in Saudi Arabia to show that it is not isolated, that it has relations in the region. On the other hand, the Saudis are much more interested in some concrete results. They need help on Yemen. They need help on their security. They want to talk about other regional issues, but the most urgent issue for them is Yemen. And so far, there hasn't been progress, or at least it hasn't been announced. The Iraqi prime minister recently was in Saudi Arabia. And also he was in Iran and announced that the talks are progressing, that the announcement of any progress will take place in Iraq. So the talks are still ongoing. There is still hope for tangible results, but we still haven't seen them. On Russia and China, just to the point, I get why the West always uses, because Europeans also use this point, that the war in Ukraine has shown how weak the Russian and ineffective the Russian military is. Take this back to the Middle East. This wouldn't be, this is not Europe. This is a context where Russian military might actually be useful. I mean, Russian military helped Bashar al-Assad remain in power, right? So you need to be relative on those things. It will not be Russia versus Ukraine that is supported by the US and the Europeans. You're talking about, Iran and the Gulf countries. So this is why, forgetting about Russia, forgetting about defense, it should be taken more relatively, I believe.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, but let me just ask as a final question, and an opportunity for you to sum up anything that you haven't touched on yet. If we project forward, say, a year from now, or even two, in the middle of the U.S. presidential campaign, how will we look back on this trip? Will we look at it as the time that President Biden went to Saudi Arabia and took the pressure off of MBS for no apparent gain, strategic or political? Or will we come away and say that really was the right decision? The United States is now in a much better position in the region than it would have been if he hadn't have gone. Aaron, let me start with you.
Look, I've been on a lot of these trips. I don't, with the exception of Jimmy Carter's March 1979 gamble trip, in which he went to Egypt and Israel in search of finalizing a peace treaty that was signed on the White House lawn the next month in March of 79. I can't point to a single trip that that is quote unquote transformative or is somehow going to move the tectonic plates. It's not the way the Middle East works. Contingency, surprises, and what is unexpected is likely to remain a dominant theme in this region for a long time to come. And I would only close by saying that America's challenge in this region is to find a set of policies to address a region that we can't transform on one hand and we can't leave on the other. If there's no transformation in the last 20 plus years, with the exception perhaps of the Abraham Accords, and they're still very much a work in progress, and there's no extrication, no transformation, no extrication, how do you find the right balance for American foreign policy? And I would submit to you the last three administrations, including this one, has not yet come up with an answer to that question. One last final point. I noticed that in an hour of this conversation, and I've been thinking about it for any number of reasons, there hasn't been a single substantive reference or discussion of the Palestinian issue. And I think we all know why that is, but that is another issue which carries great contingency in terms of the potential for causing some difficulty.
Just to be clear, maybe we don't all know, the reason is that there's unlikely to be any progress.
Correct. Yes, correct 1,000 times over. It's still an issue that resonates, however, and has a tremendous capacity for explosion and volatility.
Yasmine?
So I'm not sure Americans are going to remember this trip when really assessing the 4 years of President Biden, unless the oil prices go down, or it really depends a lot on what Russia does too. Again, I'm not sure that it would be very crucial in the assessment, given all of the other things happening inside the United States. I mean, values are important, but let's face it, again, Americans today have a long list of challenges before thinking about we rehabilitated Mohammed bin Salman. I think it's going to remain important to Congress. It's going to remain important to those who care about the freedom of media, those who care about human rights. But to American voters, I mean, you know this better than I do, the two of you, and you were discussing it when I joined you on this session. There is a long list of challenges. If Saudi Arabia is able to help with the oil, then by all means, this visit is going to be remembered as, a victory. If it doesn't, I don't even see, I don't see how it will be that crucial.
So it could be a long walk for a short slide, it sounds like. Thank you both for joining me today here. This has been fascinating for me, and thanks to all of the people who joined us and for their comments and questions. Hope to see you all again soon.
Chris and Yasmine, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye.